do some of that.
Yeah, when I
Right.
was young.
So,
It's a good place. Hotel right there on the second.
oh, is that right? I'm trying to remember. Where is it on the visitors center? Or the museum? The museum is separate.
It's not too far from there. There's a little kind of summer business district there, and it's maybe about a quarter mile, half a
Oh, I know
mile.
where it is, yeah. As soon as you get
Through into the area, there's a high-rise hotel.
It's south. It's south. I mean, it's Millennium.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
It's on a gunboat. Girls up there. You can see more. It's trying to clear out the rocks. We had, in terms of you just go out there and take a picture. They would actually try to move you to the boats and get a better shot. They were there.
So did the visitors okay?
Yeah. And they
Did they ask for help?
yes, they drafted up an agreement asking for all kinds of assistance.
So what are you going to do?
Sure. I can see her, but she's RCP. Sorry.
Guess what? We need sewers. Yeah, sit down.
If you can see it, sometimes you can get and frustrating.
That's not going to be a problem.
But what we do in meeting summaries,
Yeah, but you're doing it for
they're going back to that.
Our success meeting.
Yeah, it hasn't collapsed yet.
Because 24/7
Right.
is route.
24/6.
They
Take Fridays off.
They've been doing this.
So,
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we want to get started. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, and most operatively for today's topic, also lead up our Navigating Peace Water Initiative. I'm thrilled to have one of the members of our Water Working Group on the Future of Conflict and Cooperation, Ken Konka, here today to be presenting his new, and I can honestly say, award-winning book, Governing Water, Contentious Transnational Politics and Global Institutions Building. This is a topic that here at the center, as a place that tries to bring the worlds of scholarship and the worlds of policy together, following Wilson's legacy as the only president who's both a PhD and a scholar as well as president of the United States. This is very much an example of what we're trying to do with today's discussion and what we try to do with the Environmental Change and Security Project on a regular basis in terms of looking at issues of environment, health, development, population, and trying to understand them in broader foreign policy and security policy contexts. And a number of the themes that Ken takes up match well with these different set of varied connections. We're also thrilled that Ashok Swain has literally gotten off a plane from Sweden last night and is joining us this morning. We're happy he's going to actually be in town for a couple months, and so we hope to see him here at the center on multiple occasions. But Ashok's agreed to make some comments on the book, and so we're thrilled that he's going to do that. Let me tell you a little bit about the speakers more formally, although we have some forms out front that give you the full bios. Ken is a professor just here at the University of Maryland in Government and Politics. He's also the director of the Harrison Program on the Future Global Agenda. He is an editor for both the Association for Politics and Life Sciences and associate editor for Global Environmental Politics, one of the leading international environmental politics journals. Ken has written a number of books and has had the good sense to partner. Well, good sense or bad sense, depending. But Ken and I have done a couple books, right? And paid the price. Ken and I have done a couple books together. One of which, Environmental Peacemaking, also has a chapter by Ashok. So we have It's not entirely unconnected set of panelists today. But I should say about governing water, this is a project that Ken has become a labor of love. I think been working on, he told me just a few minutes ago, since 1996 was the first time he was putting some ideas down that have turned into this book. And it's one that those of you who are familiar with the International Studies Association know that they give out book awards each year for the best book in different categories. This is the first time one book has won both the Sprout Award for the best book on international environmental politics and the Alger Award for the best book on international organizations. And so by award winning, it's actually come to pass here just in the last few months. So we're thrilled that he's agreed to come and share some thoughts on water governance. Ashok Swain is a professor of peace and conflict research at Uppsala University in Sweden, also a water expert, also someone who has looked long and hard at water conflict and cooperation. In fact, I can wave around Ashok's book, Managing Water Conflict, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, that I also recommend to you. He has focused a lot of his time and attention on South Asia and understanding how water and development issues interact. And as you know, those of you particularly who follow the conflict side, Uppsala is one of the premier institutions for data on conflict. And so working there with the legendary Peter Wallenstein, Ashok is a real resource on a whole range of topics. And so we're thrilled that he's able to join us today. So I'll turn the floor over to Ken and let him give a presentation. Then we'll have some comments from Ashok and open it to the floor. Do want to let you know that we're webcasting the event and videotaping it. That archive video will be on the website. But what that means is when it comes to the Q&A period, we ask that you use a microphone so that your questions are picked up for the web audience as well. So Ken, please, the floor is yours.
Jeff, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today, not only because, as Jeff said, we've done a lot of work together, but also because the Environmental Change and Security Program, really, it seems to me, is a unique forum in the Washington area for talking about these issues, and obviously one that's badly needed. And so it's always a pleasure for me to be able to be here. I'd like to begin my remarks with an anecdote. It's actually the way that I begin the book. And it's about a global meeting that I attended back when I was really wrestling with some of the ideas that were going to turn into this book. It occurred in the spring of 2000. It was the Second World Water Forum, which took place in The Hague. And if you've ever attended one of these global meetings, you know that they can, the United Nations Traveling Roadshow is sort of out in full force. And I apologize for the grainy quality of some of the pictures, but as you can see here, there were over 5,000 delegates to the meeting, water experts and water advocates from all around the world. There were functionally organized stakeholder groups, farmers were represented, children were represented, all sorts of different entities were organized. We have these festively costumed water performance artists doing something. I'm not quite sure what that wasn't there at that point, at that moment. I'm not quite sure what that's about. And there was a ministerial meeting where a lot of the hard politics of water was being discussed with something like 150 water ministers from around the world. The book was really triggered by an attempt to understand what these meetings mean and what happens when this formula for global environmental governance, which I would really say over the last few decades has become something akin to the grand strategy of global environmental governance, can't effectively be applied. What do we do when the tried and true institutional forms for herding governments together and promoting inter-sovereign diplomacy for environmental protection, what happens when that formula, the political conditions for that formula simply don't exist? Do we abandon the terrain and say, well, this is simply an issue we can't tackle, this is simply the terrain of no institutional development? Or might there be other possibilities, or are there other things that are already starting to happen, we just don't happen to notice? And that was really the inspiration for the book. And I begin the book by talking about this classic attempt to herd governments together, promote international cooperation on the transboundary dimensions of the issue, and promote better domestic governance on the sovereign and domestic aspects of the issue, mobilize international resources of expertise, technology, finance, in the spirit of cooperation. And in the last few decades, really, since the 1972 Stockholm Conference, culminating with the Earth Summit in 1992, we've seen this attempt trotted out on issue after issue after issue, sometimes with great success and to the world's benefit in terms of protecting the fragile public good of our natural environment, sometimes with much less success, sometimes with fairly spectacular failures. But it does seem to be the approach that the international system returns to time and time again. And it was the approach that was clearly being attempted through this series of conferences as well. But, with apologies to Mel Brooks, a funny thing happened on the way to the World Water Forum. And this is a little grainy, and I don't know if you can catch it on the webcast. It's a newspaper article, but I'll just read it very briefly. Protesters strip at a global meet. 2 naked protesters confront Egyptian Water Resources Minister during his speech at the World Water Forum. The opening session of an international conference on global water problems was disrupted on Friday when protesters ripped off their clothes to protest a Spanish dam project. Egyptian Water Minister Mahmoud Abu Zaid looked on in silence as a man and woman disrobed in front of the speaker's podium to reveal the name of the controversial dam painted on their backs and buttocks. Other activists did not strip but scaled the walls of the conference hall and hung from the ceiling to protest what they claimed was the conference's intention to sidestep crucial environmental issues like the Itoiz Dam project in northern Spain's Navarra province. Dutch Crown Prince Willem-Alexander stepped to the podium and asked for restraint from the protesters. The protest overshadowed the start of the 5-day UN-sponsored Second World Water Forum, which will discuss new ways to ease water shortages and improve environmental and sanitary conditions worldwide. The police had to use a bolt cutter to remove one protester who chained herself to a chair. And so, in a sense, the core question of the book is, what's the relationship between this sort of contentious politics, this sort of extra-institutional, disruptive politics, and our approaches to global environmental governance? If you took a closer look at the group that was responsible for disrupting this event, they have a complicated repertoire. They are not simply about monkey wrenching and acting up and disrupting, although certainly that is much of what they do. Again, with apologies, these are just clipped off the web. I can't claim to follow them around and photograph them, but the top picture is something on the exterior of the Vatican that says SOS Itoiz. The right-hand figure is a dam that they built in the doorway of the Spanish embassy in the Netherlands. And we have the dam itself is in the center picture there. And certainly this is a group that uses local direct action to try to disrupt these sorts of projects that they consider to be ecological disasters, human rights nightmares, and greatly increasing the insecurity of local communities. Frankly, I will say, I think with some justification in many cases, in my own personal opinion. They also do a lot of transnational networking. They lobby. They issue expert critiques of the sort of discount rate that the World Bank might be using in its cost-benefit analysis of a project such as this. So they've developed over time a multifaceted and an increasingly transnationalized, globalized, if you will, repertoire of ways of trying to disrupt politics as usual around these issues. So the core question of the book is, what happens in these kinds of cases? Because I argue that this sort of politics makes it increasingly unlikely that it will be possible for governments to come to closure on the sort of inter-sovereign environmental diplomacy that, for better or worse, we have embraced as our grand strategy for protecting the global environment in the past few decades. And I argue in the book that actually there's a wide swath of environmental problems, critically important environmental problems, that have this sort of translocalized character. Our attention is usually drawn to problems of one of two kinds. Either problems that have a clear transboundary dimension. The wind carries acid rain across the border from the United States into Canada, or from west to east in Europe, or rivers flow across borders. We understand the international politics of these transboundary issues quite well, even if we can't always resolve them. And we're also, of course, drawn to those kinds of problems that sit completely outside the sovereign interstate systems. Regional commons problems like regional seas, or global commons problems like the atmosphere or the world's oceans. But the argument I try to make in the book is that there's a third dimension of global environmental governance that's critically important, which is a set of problems that we could really think of as being translocal. In many ways, both the causes and effects, the most immediate causes and effects of these problems, are quite localized. And so they don't get on the radar the way the transboundary and global commons problems do. And yet, in a world that is socially and economically globalizing, both the causes and effects of these problems extend widely beyond those locales. And so they are the stuff, for better or for worse, of global environmental governance. Water's a great example, but it's not at all limited to water. Forests, soils, grasslands, stretches of coastlines, watershed-scale effects, deserts, tundras, localized ecosystems all around the world. And what I try to argue in the book is that the reason why these issues can be so contentious and so difficult to bring to closure in the classic diplomatic manner is that they really have multiple meanings to different stakeholders. For many people, these are critical ecosystems that need to be protected, and many international resources are mobilized in that protection effort. For many other people, they're the anchors of local livelihoods. They're the anchors of local cultural systems. Anyone who's ever grown up living near a river knows exactly what that means. The way in which the river is, I grew up along the coast in New England, fisher folk essentially, and the way that stretch of coastline was woven into our livelihoods and also woven into our culture. There's quite deep fabric there, and that was the meaning that stretch of coast had to us, not a critical ecosystem. And of course, in a globalizing world economy, many of these systems also provide scarce commodities that have market value, whether it's cut timber or transported water or dammed water for electric power, or an ecotouristic vista for affluent tourists to come and take a look at. And so the argument that I make is that one of the increasingly important expressions of our global environmental politics is a very conflictual, socially contentious, often even violent politics around the multiple meanings of these localized systems that are at once critical ecosystems, anchors of local communities, and scarce commodities with some market value to some potentially powerful actors. The problem with that sort of politics is that it doesn't at all fit the standard template for international environmental diplomacy. And I won't go into detail here, but I try to make an argument. I spend about a chapter in the book trying to argue that there are some critical underpinnings for successful international environmental diplomacy, and that it's just impossible to recreate those conditions around water for many of the most contentious political issues that water engages. One is there needs to be some minimally consensually shared knowledge framework. What's the problem? What are the possible solutions? How serious are the effects? Second, given that our diplomacy is organized around sovereign states, there needs to be a fairly clear distinction between that which is international and therefore the subject of international cooperation and that which is sovereign and domestic and therefore the appropriate subject of state action. And third, the issue has to exist in a domain where key states, large numbers of key states, can credibly exercise their authority in a legitimate way. Now, the place where the state can exercise its authority in society differs from country to country, but it's important that there be an area of legitimate state authority for enough of the countries that are critical to the negotiations for the negotiations to succeed. If we can't recreate these conditions, we're unlikely to get successful international diplomacy. At best, we might get some, paper agreement that thinly papers over some real disputes. Well, one of the arguments I make in the book is that for issues like water, it's very, very difficult to create these conditions for traditional interstate diplomacy. Shared knowledge frameworks, much of our knowledge about water is local, fragmented, place-specific, highly uncertain, culturally contingent in all sorts of ways. So it's very difficult to get a consensual knowledge framework. A clear distinction between what's domestic and what's international. That's a dam that's being built in Spain, but it's being built with international resources of finance, engineering expertise, and increasingly it's a dam that's also being opposed in the international arena. So what we have here is a local conflict between a developmentally minded state and a portion of its citizenry that has been dragged into the international arena. And enough actors now feel that that dam is properly the subject of a global conversation, that they make it so, whether that makes sense or not in any particular case. And finally, a domain in which states can legitimately exercise authority. Anyone who's ever done water work or any kind of environmental work on the scale of a watershed knows that often the state is not the most authoritative actor in the watershed. The state's reach is often a questionable thing, and there are all sorts of other actors and entities in that watershed that may be highly authoritative themselves. Perhaps authoritative for traditional reasons, cultural or political reasons. Perhaps authoritative because they bring expert knowledge that's useful in the case. Perhaps authoritative because they seem to be defending a compelling moral claim. They seem to speak in a compelling way for people who should be spoken for. Perhaps authoritative because they can threaten to put 10,000 people in the street tomorrow if their voice isn't heard in the discussions. So for all sorts of reasons, a good example of successful international environmental diplomacy where these conditions could be recreated would be something like the negotiations on the stratospheric ozone layer that we saw through the mid-'80s and into the early 1990s. The Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, the London Protocol, some of the following up initiatives. It was possible to get to closure on a reasonably broadly shared knowledge framework about what was the problem and what were the key chemicals that needed to be regulated to solve the problem. There was a clear and compelling notion that this needed to be the stuff of international governance because the atmosphere is a global commons. It's the classic example of a global commons. And the idea of regulating industrial pollution was well established as an authoritative function of states for virtually all of the key states in the negotiations. And so it was possible to move forward using the conventional diplomatic formulas. But I try to argue compellingly in the book that that's very difficult to do for some of the most contentious issues around water, including the issue that brought those dam protesters out on that day. If that were all I had to say, I guess that would be a very grim and depressing message that suggests that we're really not going to be making much progress on these issues. Quite the contrary, I don't think that's the case. And what I try to do in the bulk of the book is argue that, in part because of this blockage in our traditional diplomatic formulas, we are starting to see other forms of governance emerge. And in particular, we're starting to see some very important and very interesting transnational network-based forms of governance around water issues. And in the book, I won't go into it in great detail here, but in the book I talk about the history and the emergence. I try to document essentially the emergence over a few decades of three such networks. The first is an expert network, water managers, water policy experts, water scientists of various forms, who have come together and created for themselves an increasingly dense set of transnational connections around a new paradigm of water management that's usually referred to as IWRM, or Integrated Water Resources Management. The second network that I refer to would be described by its proponents as a network advocating watershed democracy, and by its opponents as an anti-dams network. Obviously, the controversies that surround the construction of large dams and other controversial water infrastructure projects around the world. And the third network is the combination of attempts to treat water as a market good, create water markets, price water at an economically appropriate price, and then the discontent that that has produced in the forms of activism that have sprung up around that one. So in some sense, there are really sort of two network-based phenomena in that particular case. And in the book, I basically give a chapter to each of these networks. And I try to demonstrate that, I guess it depends on your definition of governance, but if you take as your notion of governance the creation and validation of knowledge about problems, solutions about problems, the mobilization of resources to be applied to the solution of problems, the legitimization of certain kinds of approaches, the authorization of certain kinds of actors, the giving of voice and representation to certain kinds of interests. If those are all key elements of governance, the extraction of resources from society, the concentration of those resources, and the redeployment of those resources in other places in a redistributive sense. If those are key elements of governance, then there's a hell of a lot of governance going on in all three of these networks, even if it's not the traditional form of sovereign or inter-sovereign governance that we may think of in global environmental politics. I don't really have time to talk about these three networks. I think there's a fascinating story in all three of them, and in some ways a very different story in all three of them, because they're very different. Sorts of entities. But the basic point that I think comes out of the trajectory, the emergence of these networks, is they are not born in attempts to herd actors together toward least common denominator forms of cooperation that can then be deepened over time, which in fact is the grand strategic approach of global environmental diplomacy. Rather, they're born in bitter social conflicts, even violent conflicts, particularly the last two, which are really protest-based networks in many ways. And it's bitter socio-ecological conflict about some very basic questions. Whose water is it? Who should decide? How much is water worth? As what and to whom? Is water a human right? Is water a market good? These are the sorts of questions that have been at stake in the controversies around large dams and water infrastructure projects, and in the controversies around whether water should be commodified, marketized, and treated as a scarce resource that can't escape the laws of efficiency and allocation. A key development in each of these networks, whether it's a more expert-based network such as the first one, which operates in certain political spaces, or protest-based networks such as the latter two, which operate in very different political spaces. A key development in all these cases is that because of globalization, actors who don't share the prevailing understandings about authority, about knowledge, about territory, have increased capacity to inject themselves into the dialogues, much in the way that those protesters injected themselves, albeit symbolically, albeit in that case just for a moment, into the opening plenary and completely disrupted the event. Well, the argument here is that these actors have injected themselves in a much more robust and permanent sort of way into dialogues about the governance of water. There's one portion of the book where I talk about governance as myth and ceremony, sort of a ritualization of our procedures and our processes, and we engage in these because we understand them to be right and true and proper. You know, they represent sort of the truth, beauty, and wisdom of how we do governance, but also because we understand them to be routine, inevitable. We have difficulty even imagining other approaches. Well, this book is about actors for whom it's not their myth and ceremony, the way that water is currently being governed. They don't embrace the myths and the ceremonies of traditional practices of governing, and they have their own. And for various reasons of their capacity to network across borders, the communications revolution, the mobility revolution, the democracy revolution around the world, they increasingly have the capacity to be important voices that can't be ignored. The short-term result of that is that the same kind of bitter social conflict that you will find in the watershed is increasingly being injected into the boardroom, the ministerial meeting, the global conference. However, and what I think really the message of the book, I hope, is that the long-run process around this kind of network building has actually been something that, while it is informal, is increasingly embedded and increasingly looks like governance, looks like the definition of norms, the articulation of rules, the mobilization of resources. And so what I try to argue is that each of these networks increasingly is a space where water governance is, in fact, occurring. In the Integrated Water Resources Management chapter, I talk a lot about the journals and the global conferences and the way that IWRM went over a space of about 2 decades from being a gleam in the eye of about 20 people to being the only legitimate language today in which one can seriously discuss international water issues. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you know, language closure is always a sort of a tricky thing because some words get left out, but nonetheless, it's a strikingly powerful trend if you look at it over the case of a couple of decades. In the watershed democracy case, I focus in particular on the World Commission on Dams and in the way that bitter opponents and ardent proponents of dams were forced by political context to come together and spend a few years together talking about what the actual historical record of large dams had been and whether it might be possible to define some rules of the road ahead. And while I certainly wouldn't wax poetic about that as a perfect exercise, it was a fascinating experiment that I think produced some very important lessons. And a similar sort of stakeholder participation process has started to gel around water marketization issues with the discussions about private sector participation and public-private partnerships and some of the other things that are going on in the last few years in that domain. However, so that's essentially the first half of the book. However, at the end of the day, the critical question, of course, is how is water actually governed? Well, one of the points that I would make is that some of the governance actually goes on in those networks. And so in the same way that we might ask, how is water actually governed in a place like Brazil or a place like South Africa or a place like Southern California, we should also ask, how is water governed in the expert network of water managers? How is water governed in the contentious debate around dams and so on? But it is, of course, critically important that we bring it back to the state at the end of the day and say, well, that continues to be a critically important space. So there are two very lengthy, detailed case studies of how water governance has changed in Brazil and in South Africa over the last 15 or 20 years. And that's because I think at the end of the day, the real test is how do the national level frameworks and then down to the local level frameworks for governing water respond to all of this foment and informal institutional development that I've been talking about. I chose Brazil and South Africa for a couple of reasons. One is just serendipitous. I've done a lot of work in Brazil. I speak good Portuguese, and that's essential for this sort of work. And so Brazil was sort of a no-brainer for me. I've been getting increasingly interested in doing some work in Southern Africa. But beyond that, there are really two reasons. First, there was a window of opportunity in both countries to change governance practices dramatically. With the end of apartheid in South Africa, a century of water law policy and practice was delegitimized and invalidated because water had been a critically important mechanism of social control for the white minority regime. It was quite clear that dramatically new practices around water were going to emerge in South Africa. A somewhat more subtle but similar process occurred in Brazil with the end of military rule in the 1980s because of the way that the military regime had been governing water had been largely delegitimized as well. That may be a limiting condition of these cases in terms of their generalizability because, as we know, usually politics is quite incremental. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at a couple of countries where the window had been thrown open? And given all of this foment about everything from dams to expert knowledge to water marketization, what exactly is it that flies in through the window when the window gets open? And I think the story about what has most successfully flown in through the window in these two cases is actually somewhat surprising and quite fascinating. The second reason I chose Brazil and South Africa is Brazil is the wettest country in the world by any measure, and South Africa is one of the driest. And yet, if you look at the actual process of policy reform in these two countries, it is extraordinarily similar. They wrote very similar national framework laws at approximately the same time with strikingly similar content, and they went about trying to implement those laws in not entirely similar ways, but in ways that had enough broad overlap that we have to stop and say, wait a minute, something's really going on here, and we should try to understand that. Just to very quickly review what some of that common content is in these two national framework processes, that really were, the laws were written in the mid-90s, and the last decade has been all about the struggle to try to implement these laws. First, ownership. Water is the patrimony of the nation. Water is a national resource. You can't own water, you can't own more water than fits in your bathtub in either of these countries, essentially. Now, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but essentially water is a national resource. You can license it, you can get permitted to use it, but you cannot own it. The role of the state historically had been to provide public goods of water by building water infrastructure. The last decade has been about trying to transition the state away from that traditional role and more toward the idea of the state as the guardian of the public water trust, which has some important ramifications for creating new functions for the state, but also dismantling some of the old functions. The core management concept, and this was one of the more revolutionary ideas, is that the river basin should be the primary unit of management, not the political jurisdictional unit. And both countries essentially laid down basin or catchment level administrative schemes on top of pre-existing political jurisdictional schemes of the town, the county, the state, and on up and so on. The end of riparianism, water rights tied to land rights in both countries. Water rights come from water permits, which come from the state. And other than a sort of historical grandfathering that's starting to expire in a very dramatic way in South Africa just recently, water rights will be permitted and allocated, and there are no particular privileges, although historical claims will to some extent be acknowledged. There are no particular privileges that go with having had historical riparian rights, which is that hasn't been made real entirely in either country yet, but it's a revolutionary concept about water rights. Both countries have constitutional guarantees that citizens have a right to an adequate supply of water, and basic human needs is prioritized over all other uses of water in the national legislation. Again, making that real. It's just the beginning of the story in some sense, but it is a radical departure and an interesting one. Both countries in their economics move toward the ideal, if not the practice, of pricing water what it costs to replace it. Cobrança is the Portuguese word, the Brazilian Portuguese word for the tariff that is actually collected from water users and is supposed to then be recycled into improvements on the basin scale in water supply, water demand management, water environmental protection, etc. And both of the framework laws have very ambitious notions about stakeholder participation, both in the narrow sense that if you have a vested interest at the basin level, you are a stakeholder, but also in the broader sense that there are broader social interests that also should be represented by stakeholder voices in the dialogues. Now, I'm not even going to try to talk about the two cases. They're very rich. I could talk in the Q&A, or you can read the chapters or whatever you want to do. There are a couple of key themes that I think come out of looking at how these various transnational networks that I'm talking about influenced this process of reform over a period of more than a decade. The first key theme is, what were the sources of policy innovation in these two countries? International law was not an important source of policy innovation in either country, even though Brazil and South Africa are two of the most diplomatically active countries in international water law. They both have hugely important river basins that cross borders, and they've been, for decades now, been building legal relationships and legal partnerships with neighboring states. And yet, the pattern that I found was that far from that being a source of innovation and dynamism, where the international legal principles might then, no pun intended, swim upstream into domestic practices, I found the basins that were most ensconced in these international relationships were often the basins where the least amount of innovation was going on. And that was an important and a striking finding. Rather, it was the informal linkages, including the informal linkages that were created by the transnational protest networks and controversies, that were critically important sources of policy innovation. Second thing that I found was, what was the role of the integrated water resources management and that powerful, increasingly powerful knowledge network that was built. What I found in both countries was that it played a critically important role in helping to dismantle old practices, partly by making them look irrational, partly by suggesting that there are better ways, but quite frankly, partly also by making them look unfashionable. There are constant references in the Brazilian and the South African reform processes to state-of-the-art best international practices as a way to try to validate what domestic entrepreneurs in Brazil and South Africa, and I mean policy entrepreneurs, not economic entrepreneurs, wanted to do. The point was not at all that Brazil and South Africa were passive recipients of some global wisdom. Quite the contrary. The striking thing in both of these cases was there were people on the ground that were pushing these kinds of policy innovations 10 years before they became fashionable in the international networks. And one of the main sources for the ideas in the international networks was in places like Brazil and South Africa, where water conflicts have been going on domestically for an awfully long time for various reasons. So the point is not to suggest that there's this sort of north-south flow of wisdom. Nothing could be further from the truth in these cases. But The validation of these ideas in these international networks was a critically important form of empowerment in the domestic political struggle for actors who wanted to push new ideas. Whether that was an idea about what the price of water ought to be, or whether that was an idea that indigenous peoples ought to have a seat at the table in the dialogues. So that's what I mean when I say that the transnational expert networks played a role in tearing down the old. However, it was also striking to me in both of these cases how limited the transnational expert networks were in their ability to help build the new. And I would argue that the central reason for that is that we've never really gotten a good answer out of IWRM about what do we really mean by participation. Does that simply mean that people are on a mailing list and once a year they get to voice a grievance? Or does that mean a much more active form of watershed-scale democracy, or something in between? What do we really mean about the right price for water? What is the marginal cost of water? I've never had a water economist be able to clearly explain to me what the marginal cost of water is. Do we mean the replacement cost? Do we mean simply, recovering the variable costs that go with water provisioning? Do we mean recovering the costs for the next generation of water infrastructure? It's quite ambiguous. And so the striking thing about the expert networks was they played a critically important role. But it was much more about creating space for new practices than giving specific notions of content to those new practices. A couple of, again, I know Asher probably has a lot to say. I know he's actually read the book because he actually was one of the reviewers for the book, and so I know he has a lot to say, so I will wrap up quite quickly here. The courts in both countries became critically important spaces. Once these new constitutions and framework laws were written, having enough democratic space that actors could use the courts to try to validate these practices. And so there's a fascinating story. And one of the elements of that story is the openness of the legal systems in both countries to various forms of international influence. Very much unlike the American legal system, which is, except in maybe tort law and a few other places where they just can't ignore it anymore, very reluctant to find precedent, to find best practice, to find any kind of a pathway forward in international law or in someone else's domestic law. South Africa in particular, and Brazil to a somewhat lesser extent, very open to that. And therefore the courts became nodes in these transnational networks that I'm trying to describe. And the last points that I've made, I've already made the last 2 points, which is that this is not the passive receptance of international wisdom. It's domestic political struggles in which what's going on in these international networks creates symbolic resources, political resources, material resources, anything from an idea to a plane ticket for people on the ground who are actually trying to promote reforms. The final chapter of the book really tries to draw from this some lessons, some observations, some suggestions about the path forward. And here I would really suggest just 3 points. The first point is that I think we need to recognize that making progress on these translocal controversies has really emerged, in my mind, as the critical task of global environmental governance. If your notion of global environmental governance is governing better in ways that will benefit the vast majority of the world's people in the most immediate sense, then coastlines, watersheds, trees, water, forests, soils, agroecological systems. That's really where the energy and the action of global environmental governance needs to be. Not necessarily limited to the traditional tried and true interstate diplomatic mechanisms, but perhaps in this more open manner that I've been trying to describe. What we are seeing when we look into these arenas is, to some extent, intersovereign stalling, paralysis, difficulties in moving forward. I'm quite comfortable calling the 2002 Johannesburg conference Rio -10. There's no question about that in my mind. But at the same time, we are seeing in other arenas and in other channels, not the resolution of these conflicts. Dams are still as contentious as they ever were. The right price for water is still as contentious as it ever was. We're still seeing localized violence all around the world around both of those questions. But we are starting to see the institutionalization of the conversations around those. And that is a critically important form of institution building that I think we need to recognize. And therefore, we need to recognize that social conflict can be an important form of international institution building in a globalizing world system. And the final point would be, well, what does progress then mean? Because these are not institutions that you can design. If you study the trajectory in all three of these cases, things took hold for various historical reasons in ways that it would have been possible to approach, from a metaphor of architecture, from a metaphor of design, from a metaphor of bricklaying. But I do think a metaphor of nurturing is, in fact, appropriate. And the big deficit here in our intergovernmental machinery is the process mechanisms. We organize our institutions issue by issue, substantive domain by substantive domain, and we come back to the same kinds of process mechanisms for those over and over and over again. So I try to talk a little bit in the book about some innovations in stakeholder dialogues, conflict resolution techniques, mechanisms of cooperative knowledge building that might be important process mechanisms for the way forward. It's a big book. It's a dense book. It's 462 pages long. That's just a quick take of what's inside the covers, but hopefully that gives you a good idea of whether it's compelling enough to take a look at. Let me stop at that point, and would love to hear what Ashik has to say.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, asking me to come and comment on this book, I think it's a pleasure and privilege. I have read this book 3 times, and I thought it would be easy task to do the comments, and particularly, it's very easy to read a book, particularly if you like the topic and you like the author. But when you are asked to comment on them, then it becomes a bit of a challenge. But I will start with saying that's great stuff. I mean, it might be 400 or 50 odd pages, but I think I like the book so much that I could read 3 times. I mean, I started reading in the morning also, so it's a 4th time today. It's very easy to read and very well formulated. So there is, I thought, I mean, I know when you asked me, it's no problem at all. So the one thing which I want to say also, the meeting which you mentioned in the beginning, that's the Hague meeting. I was there with you as well. And I remember that after that, all this episode in the first time, then I was asked by the BBC radio program that what do you think about this? I mean, what's your opinion about this protest? I said, that's fun. But I didn't realize that you took it so seriously, and and I'm happy that you took it so seriously. We all talk about the water governance, and this good governance has become things which all in the water management people would like to talk about. When we talk about water governance, a good governance of water resources, we think about the political, social, economic, and administrative systems which will manage the water and which will provide the supply to the people that really need it. We think about participation, we think of accountability, inclusiveness in the management, in the decision making, transparency, and responsiveness. These are the kind of fundamental principles when we are talking about this water governance or good governance of the water resources. It's a multi-structured one. We all know about it because we all think about this global structure. There is a regional structure, there is a national one and the local one. And they are not like in the different frames, but they are all interconnected one as well. And it's a lot of discussion which has been going on how this local one is influenced or influencing the global one. Setting up a global water regime or for good water governance has not been successful yet. That's what the book has clearly demonstrated. Even not a single legal framework, which global regime is a big thing, but having a global legal framework for water governance, water sharing, we haven't able to achieve that one, though this process has been going on for so many years. It started with the International Law Associations since 1960s. It took the International Law Commission. Now it's in the UN. The ratification process is taking so long. We don't know where it will go, in spite of the fact that, as Ken was mentioning, the kind of so many actors were involved in this one, and there have been, as someone has said, that the Halloween candy is there for each one to be happy about it, but nobody, I mean, very, very few of them are actually endorsing it or ratifying it. Even I find, coming from Sweden, or working there for so long, it's a strange thing that even Norway and Sweden don't like each other on that issue. I mean, they have openly gone against each other. I mean, they do like to criticize among themselves, but in the international fora, it's very difficult to find that kind of instances when Norway and Sweden are opposing this kind. But it's nothing to worry about. I think it's one of the best good development in this sense, as I say it, because it's the golden principle is not to have a golden principle in the water management, at least. Imagine if we ask to follow the Rhine management in the Ganges or in the Jordan River system. That can be quite difficult to achieve, if we possibly will achieve, and that will never be lasting enough due to various other reasons. So I think this is somehow which is creating a local or the national or the regional or basin-wide structures where we are looking at the different regimes coming up or the different management systems coming up, considering those situations and considering the local demand and the national influence. The book deals with almost everything of importance in the water governance discussion. You name it: water scarcity, supply, demand, river sharing, international water resource integrated water resource management, water market, protests, water networks, and of course the evolution of the global water regimes. There are two excellent case studies which the book has done. I mean, Brazil and South Africa. If you heard of, I would have personally liked to see one more cases from Asia, of course. It could have been much more, more three. But otherwise, I don't have any regrets on these case studies. One thing on South Africa, which you have very clearly or very rightly points out, that the popular resistance is less in the projects or the infrastructure projects compared to market areas. So particularly when the water marketization is taking place, there are more popular protests in South Africa. I think I've been a bit nicer to South Africa. When I was in South Africa looking for a popular protest against a dam in the mid-90s, it was a big shock for me because it felt like South Africa is like India in 1960s or 70s. Everybody wanted to talk about building big dams, or most of the demand was to build these big structures. Of course, there has been there are lots of popular movement was taking place of getting the water supply, how the water rights and all kinds of stuff. But there was very little on this against the infrastructure and its adverse developments. So it was like for them temples of modern South Africa for some time, like the ones which two more things. Ken in this book has shown the contentious politics on water resources has challenged and to a large extent altered the territory, authority, and knowledge, these three areas which have been there. So we'll argue that you have to believe it, and I do it, and I did it. One thing which I just need to mention, that the important politics around water can be sometimes misleading and confusing. The contentious politics around water. is the water is the reason in these projects or in these movements or this, the people, those who are the international networks, those who are promoting it, or the people, those who are opposing this kind of projects? Is the water is the reason or the reason something else? If water is not the reason, how it will really affect the governance or water management or water region? That's something which I'm gradually trying to understand, but still a bit confused. As you all know about this Narmada controversy, the Sardar Sarovar's dam and all this, which you have also brought up quite a number of instances in the book. Recently, it has again come to the picture in India. It's a huge conflict again has started on. It comes each and every year in different phases. There is now a film star is involved because he made a comment that the people, those who are supposed to be given, the people, those who have been displaced, they should be given proper rehabilitation and all kinds of stuff. But then, because that's two things. That's a regional differences has come up. That's I understand. The second thing, which a recent study has also come out, that there is a class difference now. The people, those who have been displaced, and the people, those who have not been displaced. The people, those who have been displaced, that the rehabilitation package has become so good that they have become so better off that it has created a class difference between the people, those who have not been displaced. If that is true, then the kind of all these movements, all these international networks, those who are supporting it, then the issue is not then the rehabilitation, the issue is not displacement, the issue is something else. The issue is not the water. So these are the things which which someone tries to think about it. Is that something going on? I have been looking at this displacement dam movements, people who are protesting against the dams in a southeastern state in India, where I actually originally come from. It's a 40 million population. It's divided into two parts, geographically, socially, economically, culturally, you can say. One is the indigenous population, which the Indians call tribals. And then there is a coastal population. There have been few years back, they have built several dams in these tribal areas, but there has been very little protest movements about this. The rehabilitation package has been quite less. But in the last 2 years, the situation has changed dramatically, and suddenly everyone has started talking about proper rehabilitation. I talked to the persons who is responsible. He is even talking much more than even the World Bank can think of, providing the rehabilitation package, making them the stakeholders in the path of development, means giving them the free electricity, free water after they get displaced, because they think that the dam belongs to them for the rest of their life if the people who have been displaced. Why the situation has come to this extent? In the 2-3 years, what really made this change? It's thanks to a ultra-left movement which has come up there. It's a Naxalites movement which we all see in Nepal recently, but there is a part which has been affected, and that has brought a sudden transformation to the power structure of the people, those who have been marginalized. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced in that particular region, and without any compensation for 40-50 years. And suddenly the whole structure has changed. And so this is something which I think is important to look at it, how this really makes this work, how far the water really plays this role, or there are other politics, either identity or a region or what. The other issue, I think you have, as I said, you have covered so many issues and so well. One is the water marketization and you have also brought in this trade, water trade. I think that one I want to little highlight. The water trade issue has got less attention than what it deserves, because the situation has changed due to various reasons, particularly the technological development, as well as the development or the sudden development in certain part of the countries or certain part of the regions in the world, that which has created somehow a very certain scenario of increasing water trade or bulk water trade in very near future. The people in Shanghai, they want to drink Canadian water. The people in some parts of in China and some parts of in India, they want to drink Norwegian water. And there has been also the trade going on. The trade has been going on also between Singapore and Malaysia. It's a different trade. Malaysia gives raw water to Singapore. Singapore cleans it up, sends back a little higher price to Malaysia. The mainland China also sends the water to Hong Kong. But the thing is, these water trades which has taken place through the pipelines and in a short distance, but the dynamic is changing, because with the way the discussion is going on, or recently also the agreement which was signed between Egypt and Israel, but to divert, to send some water in the tankers from the, of course these are the domestic rivers in Egypt, to send the water to Israel. But now several Norwegian companies are involved in developing these huge balloons where they can put the water and they can tow away with these water tankers across the sea, and it'll have a very large volume of water. And there are different possibilities which has come, particularly this water trade, which will challenge whatever the kind of somehow we have found a working system in the water management in the world. And if that goes on that way, I think it might create a number of other issues, and which I'm not sure how that will be tackled. But these are the things which probably, we need to take up in the future. But I think this book has done its whatever it's supposed to do. It has really raised the interest, brought into this two disciplines together, because it has been always a problem. Being an international politicals, or as a student of international politics, if you are working on water issues, you never know. Sometimes you are challenged by the water people that you are not really water guy, and then the international political scientists don't like it because you are not doing a research on a very soft issue. But I think you have shown that this can be brought together, and this topic, with the help of the water research, you can contribute quite strongly to also the international organizations, international relations literature. In the end, I think I will probably, you don't get that many chances to end the comment with your own quote, but I would like to quote this one myself. I think it's a very authoritative, nuanced, and comprehensive. The book is in its coverage. It should be on the reading list of anyone concerned with water management and politics. Thank you very much, Ken.
Well, now we have an opportunity to continue the discussion. Again, I ask if you would please use one of the two microphones that my colleagues will bring to you. Let us know who you are, and who would like to kick us off? Gentleman over here, and then we'll go back there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conta. My name is Dave Clark. I'm with Inside Green Business, a publication, and I'm interested to know what the role of the private business sector is in this conflictual model that you described.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to just take them as they come, or do you want to collect some?
Why don't we collect a couple we have?
That's a good point.
My name is Mai Fiel. I'm from Food and Water Watch. I run the water program there. I'm very interested in hearing a little bit more detail on how both Brazil, but in particular South Africa, has interpreted water laws through the courts.
Okay. Why don't I just collect a couple of them, Sean, another one on this other. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask about desalinization. I'm sure you already addressed this issue before I walked into the room, but I wanted to see where you thought it was most politically and economically feasible to desalinize water and pump it through public pipes as opposed to shipping it across the ocean.
Okay, terrific. And if you could tell us who you are, sir?
Peter Fargo from EPA.
Terrific, thanks. And then just on the other side of the camera, Sean? Right, or Alice? Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Flavia. I work for the Global Freshwater with WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. I'm Brazilian, so I'm very glad to see that people are writing about my country.
Bem-vindo.
Obrigada. My question relates to your chapter on a search for a global regime for international rivers. The Helsinki Convention that was adopted under the EC, the European Commission for Europe, the convention has just been amended to allow non-EC members to ratify. And it has 6 countries that accepted the amendment so far. Do you see this convention potentially becoming a global regime for international water resources?
Okay, why don't we take those, and we have a couple more, and we'll do another round. But Ken, why don't we-
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Great questions. Okay, I'll take them in the order that they came. There's a lot to say, I think, about business, private sector roles, and let me just point out a few of the more interesting ways I think they turned up on the radar in what I did. In both of the contentious controversies that are really at the heart of the book, the dams controversies and water infrastructure controversies and the marketization controversies, what's striking about the forms of institutional development that I see going on is that in some sense, non-state actors and state actors have undergone a sort of a role reversal. I'll just talk about one of the two, which is the World Commission on Dams, in the interest of time. In that case, the activists had gotten to the point where it was getting very difficult to build dams, and the World Bank and the big companies wanted some guidance. They basically got to the point where they said, look, we need to sit down and we need to talk about whether it's going to be possible to build any dams at all, under what circumstances is it going to be possible to build dams. And so they reached out through some moderate environmental organizations, and there was a very contentious workshop that was held in Gland, Switzerland, that almost blew up 4 or 5 times and so on. And out of that was born a stakeholder panel that sat for a couple of years. What was striking about that panel was that there was very little traditional governmental representation on that panel. The chair of the panel was Kader Asmal of South Africa, and he was the former water and education minister in South Africa. He had a lot of credibility with the activists because of the whole situation with apartheid. He had been in exile. He was basically one of the chief constitution writers for the African National Congress in the new constitutional process and so on. So for a water minister, he had an unusual degree of credibility in the activist community. There was a senior Indian diplomat who was the number 2 on the commission, but he wasn't really a state-based representative of the Indian government in any way. The Chinese minister was a member of the commission, but then withdrew for reasons that were never entirely clear. It was said to be illness, but China didn't replace her on the commission, and so on. And the rest of the commissioners were people from the private sector who were, the head of one of the biggest, the CEO of ABB, one of the biggest, dam enterprises, was on the commission. The head of the International Commission, former head of the International Commission on Large Dams, and so on, and then several people from activist organizations were there as well. What was striking was that if this had been a sort of a conventional diplomatic exercise, governments would have come together and negotiated their terms of reference, and then tried to take it out and encourage buy-in on the part of non-state actors. Encourage private sector participation, persuade the activist community that it was a good step forward, and so on and so forth. In this case, you had those outside parties on the inside actually negotiating the terms themselves, and then trying to go back to governments and re-inject it into national policy dialogues with highly variable degrees of success. This was clearly going to be a very tough sell in India or China, given the emphasis on building dams in those countries. But there are many other examples where there were very interesting national level dialogues that came along. So one of the most interesting things that's going on is that I think that the paralysis in intergovernmental forums is causing business actors, activists, scientists, all sorts of other actors to start to take on some of those governance functions. Now that raises very profound questions about, to what extent is that appropriate, who appointed them anyway, and there are some real questions about are stakeholders just sort of, taking this iron triangle of corporatism that we often see at the domestic level and elevating it to the global level. So there are narrow and there are broader stakeholder processes. But in both of these arenas, there's no question that private sector actors are starting to sit down and play that almost diplomatic, are being forced to play that sort of diplomatic function. So that would probably be my principal comment on that. On water law in South Africa, there's also a lot to say. A couple of the more interesting things. The South African Constitution creates two kinds of rights. There are some rights that are absolute, and there are some rights that are subject to what's known as the Progressive Realization Clause. Because there was such a social deficit when the ANC came to power in 1994, and because the Constitution went so far in creating rights for citizens, including socioeconomic rights for citizens, such as a right to water, right to public health, education, et cetera, there's also a clause about progressive realization that acknowledged in the Constitution and has been interpreted as such by the courts to say that in some instances the South African government is not required to realize those rights immediately, but to make good progress, essentially. And so then it has to be arbitrated as to what constitutes good progress. Water is one such right because there were many, untold millions. I mean, I've seen different estimates, but there are tens of millions of people in South Africa that didn't have access to safe drinking water and sanitation services when the ANC came to power in 1994. So since then, it's been a question of instance by instance and case by case of the courts making decisions. The courts have been pretty aggressive. They have found water rights for squatters, for example, which in some ways, getting back to Ashok's point, is it really about the water? In that instance, it might not be about the water. Water might be the legal vehicle that can be used to firm up the rights of squatters to stay in one place, to begin to build some informal infrastructure for themselves, and so on. The most important court decisions with regard to water have had to do with the constitutional right. The World Health Organization says that 50 liters per person per day is sort of a bare minimum standard for healthy sort of, direct water use. And with the marketization in South Africa and the increase in water prices in many municipal areas, and the cutting off by companies or by the state. I use the term marketization rather than privatization because often it's not private companies, it's the state itself that is pushing these pricing reforms and so on and so forth. And that's the case in most of the places in South Africa where it's happening, although there are a few privatizations that are important. There was a big brouhaha about the people being cut off from water because they didn't have their 50 liters per person per day. And so the upshot of that is now that South Africa has a sort of an inverted block system where they don't say 50 liters per person per day. They basically say the household equivalent for a household of 8 of 20 liters per day. 25, sorry, right, 25, half the WHO standard, that's right, 25 on a monthly basis. So the courts have basically been willing to go a little further with that than the Progressive Realization Clause of the Constitution requires them to go. That being said, one of the principal responses to that decision and the 25 liters per day is these tricklers now that the local water companies will put in. And so essentially, there's a couple of ways of getting water. One is these prepaid swipe cards, and we've had cholera outbreaks in South Africa when the pumps break. So I certainly don't want to overstate the water security of the average poor South African because there's clearly great conditions of water insecurity still. The other thing is that if you don't pay your water bill, they'll put a trickler, which is a little, sort of like a little washer into your pipes, and then if you leave the tap on full blast, you'll get the equivalent of your 25 liters per person per day times a household size of 8 by the end of the month by the water sort of trickling out over time. So it is not the case that the courts have created a realizable absolute right to water security for poor South Africans. Quite the contrary. That being said, I would certainly argue that the water rights movement in South Africa has gotten much more of a toehold than it otherwise would have in the current economic climate without the courts. If you want to follow up on that before I take the others, please do.
Just a point of clarification, because what you're saying is not, in my opinion, not exactly correct. The 25 liters policy has not been interpreted through the courts. That was a cost-benefit analysis that started out of Durban, and it's not sort of from a court process. But there has been significant challenges, and not specifically on water as I see it, but the Grootboom case, for example.
Right. Well, it ultimately came through through DWAF, right, the Department of Water and Forestry. But the reason why it did was because the accumulation of a lot of these local court cases. It gotten to the point where they had to do this, or they were going to get that sort of a court interpretation. So I viewed what DWAF did with the 25 liters per day as a sort of preemptive shot to prevent it from being the sort of firm court case that you're describing. So yes, I don't think we disagree in that regard. On desalinization, I mean, there are many places in the world where desalinization is going on today, in sort of niche contexts and so on. I'm not an authority, but I sort of view it. I've said this before. I think I've said this here before. I view it as sort of akin to, 20 years ago, the conversations about nuclear fusion. It was one of those technologies that was just over the horizon in terms of its mass application in solving our problems, and seemingly always has been just over the horizon in that sense. The big problem with desalinization, as it's currently usually carried out, is it's so energy intensive that you're sort of trading your water problem for your energy problem, and either energetically or financially, there are many places where that doesn't yet make sense to do so. So in that sense, it's not primarily a technological feasibility question. It's more of an economic feasibility question. My understanding is, I'm not a technologist, but my understanding is there are a lot of innovative things going on with smaller scale and decentralized and solar-based desalinization for island economies and things like that. And it's quite possible that a more of a soft path approach to desalinization will emerge from some of that, rather than the more capital-intensive, infrastructure-oriented approach that has historically been the case. But I have to say that I don't see it as going much beyond the sort of the niche areas where it's already of use in the near future. And the point about Helsinki and the global regime, it's interesting. We did a study at the University of Maryland recently, just published in June, of river basin agreements around the world, both hard law and soft law river basin agreements. We basically took all agreements that we could, and we coded them for their principled content. In other words, we weren't so interested in the fact that two or more governments in a river basin had come together and written an agreement or jointly announced an agreement, but rather what the agreement actually said. What sort of governing principles did it contain? And we looked at things like, we basically took the UN Framework Convention, which grew out of the earlier, the 66 Helsinki principles that Ashok was referring to. And we picked out 9 or 10 principles that we considered to be key to basin-level governance. Prior notification if you're going to build anything in the basin. Sharing of information. All countries in the basin should be part of the agreement. Environmental protection. Sovereign rights of states. Equitable use of the water, avoiding significant harm to other parties, and we coded these agreements. It was an interesting result that we got, but the main result that we got was that those principles, those sort of soft law articulations, which had really been bubbling up, as Ashok said, since the 1960s, and then they were in the International Law Commission for 20 years, got to the General Assembly, voted, the ILC articles were voted out to the General Assembly, I want to say 91, and the General Assembly passed an amended version in 97, and as you said, it didn't enter into force by the target date of 2001, because only a handful of, it had a pretty low threshold for back home ratifications in order to enter into force, and it didn't make that. And the pattern that we saw and what was actually going on at the basin level in the agreements, because that was just a framework, like in the Helsinki, it's just a framework convention that's supposed to inform basin by basin by basin specific agreements, because wisely it's recognized that every basin, do you have two states that are upstream, downstream, or do you have two that are side by side, or do you have like the Danube 17? I mean, every basin's going to have to be governed in a different way. The thing that we found was that there wasn't one emergent global legal regime for basins. If you just looked at the principles, how are they getting deeper over time? Are they getting wider over time? Are they popping up in new basins? That's what we tried to study. And we found that there wasn't this sort of gradual incrementalist process of the building of a global set of principles that was spreading basin by basin. First, we found that while the principles were increasingly being embraced, they weren't taking on deeper meaning over time. 20 years later, we were still getting fairly superficial articulations of what it means to protect the environment or what it means to share water equitably. And we developed all these what we call deepening indicators to see if a treaty that was written in the year 2000 would have a substantially more robust meaning to that than a treaty that was written in 1980 when those ideas might have been relatively new. And we were somewhat discouraged to find that there wasn't a lot of that sort of deepening going on. That was an important finding. The second thing that we found was that there were great regional variations and that Europe is just different. Europe's different than North America. Europe's very different than most of the developing countries in terms of the kinds of water political dynamics that bring countries together. Awful lot of the water rights are allocated. There's a different consensual understanding about environmental protection. There's a different understanding about participation. And so one of the best predictors in our study that an agreement would be different on those terms was its geographic location, with Europe really being an outlier. So the question of whether that Europeanization, which is a very interesting development, could extend more globally, it seems to me that that's a real question about it. Third thing we found was that if you look at the real patterns, there wasn't one emergent water regime, there were two. There was one cluster of principles that was occurring in an awful lot of agreements that really tended to reinforce the state's rights to water. Equitable use and equitable sharing of the water, recognition of the sovereign rights of states, and associated sorts of principles. There was a second cluster of principles that really had to do with sort of, managing the harmful impacts of water's use. Stakeholder participation, environmental protection, information sharing, conflict resolution kinds of mechanisms. So in some way, the world seems to be sort of bifurcating between these basins, particularly in developing countries, where water allocation and sharing was still the front and center issue, and in other basins, including some in developing countries and many in the north, where the question was really more about managing the harmful impacts.
I think some more questions. Nadia, up in the front, and down in the back. Good.
My name is Nadia Saad. I'm retired from the World Bank. I was in The Hague, and it was quite an extraordinary meeting. And if you remember, I left. Since then, I've had this problem, and I don't know how really it can ever be resolved. You remember there were scenarios at that meeting, and these scenarios, the conclusion of the scenarios were that in 25 years from now, there is this part of the world which is in the arid zone, and whatever policy you would have, they will end up by facing serious crisis. So there is this thing on one hand. On the other hand, it just created for me a sort of philosophical problem, because if water is one global system, it is one global system, water cycle, whatever you do in one part impacts the other part. So it has to be governed as it is, that is globally. Now, so the principle is that do we adapt our institutions and laws to the system as it is, or do we force the system to work with our own institutions? This is a fundamental question, and it touches on beliefs, and this is why you see Mahmoud Abu Zaid standing up in every meeting and saying, I will never accept that water is treated as a commodity, that a price is measured. Water belongs to everybody. Nobody has a right to water, and everybody has an equal right. So you have here this problem. How do you respond to it? The second problem that comes out of this is a problem of environmental justice. That is, if I live in this poor countries, arid countries. I have the same right as the guy who lives in Canada, who says he owns 45% of the global water, fresh water of the world. Now, who am I and who is he? Why is he going to ever, always, forever be richer and happier than me? So if I say I have right to water, it's the same thing as saying I have right to life. I have right to a human, whatever human being has right to live a proper life. So am I going, where do I go to complain? If I can.
Okay. You can always come to the Wilson Center and complain. I also wanted to go a couple in the back, and then Sean, if you could go to, okay. Why don't we do one in the back and then the gentleman here? Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I am Benazir Akbar from Osgood Center of International Studies. There has been so much talk going on about the quantity of water, and I'm concerned about the quality of water. Because for me, getting water clean enough to drink is as important as getting water to drink at all. So does your book address this issue? Or do the international governance institutions have any plan to implement measures that would maintain or ensure clean water for everyone to drink? Or for any use for that matter? Thank you.
Gentlemen, if you could go here, and if you could just keep passing that other one down. Okay.
Mike Hood, Bureau of Reclamation, Department of the Interior. Not to belabor the World Commission on Dams at length, but how would you characterize the lessons learned from that process? And also, do you think it will have long-term important impact, I guess? Given the amount of time and resources that were devoted to it, I'd be interested in your comments on that.
I'm Jayashilan Raj from Osgood Center for International Studies. My question is related to the basic aspect that you raised, is the contentious politics, because as far as I heard, I didn't get the definition for contentious politics. Do you mean the means that they derive to address the issues? And I believe when we speak about global management of water, we many times many local issues are not addressed, but the impact of why they come to, for example, the major contentious politics originate from grassroots level, as far as I understood. So what are the reasons? First of all, I would say it's, as far as I understood, it's related to the conventional wisdom that for example, it's related to foreign aid, whether it comes to building of dams, whether any development project, what they call is based on Washington consensus, is not good for the people who live even now in the primary sectors, depends on forest or agrarian economy. So the basic question is, as you told, whether is it part of they form, for example, the means that they derive is a struggle to form a civilian base to address their issues. Because you told even the state is stepping out of, for example, I would say the state is stepping out of the affirmative action and engage in marketization of water. So the man who spoke before me addressed to whom we need to complain, even the state stepping out of the issue, then there is a question of political legitimization, even though there is a wide social legitimization. So how you address the contentious politics and what are the reasons? And also one more point is the relation between conventional wisdom and trickle down, means the development, the general conventional notion that the development never trickled down. It's a kind of, they view it as in a cynical view, and even the re-emergence of the leftist movement that Dr. Swain addressed. And as far as the two cases in India, if we take the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and there is a Plachimada Coca-Cola issue going in my own state. I'm hailing from Kerala. So the general notion, as he told, is not only the issue of water, but the related issue, for example, their past experience, they derive from the so-called multinational or transnational companies. They come and, they say exploit water. So how you address whether do you think that my general question is an attempt to form a civilian base for these struggles that they try to the means that they derive lead to the contentious politics.
Okay. There's a lot there. I have we have two. Why don't you take these and then we'll go. The gentleman. No, hold on to that microphone if you would, sir, because we'll come right back to you and then over there after Ken does these. Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot. I mean, I'll be very quick, but that's going to do violence to good answers, so I'll do what I can. On the question of the World Commission on Dams and the long-run impact, given the resources that are put into it and so on, I guess I'd say three things. First, it was extraordinarily inexpensive. I guess it depends on what you consider. I mean, the total budget of the World Commission on Dams was a very small amount of money compared to the copious amounts of money that were tied up in the things that the Commission was studying. And I think if you think no useful knowledge was produced, then even $20 would have been wasted. But I, looking at it, think that we actually invested a relatively small amount of money. And when you look at where the money came from, it wasn't really coming from any one particular source. There's several governments, foreign aid branches kicked in money. Some of the bigger NGOs kicked in certain amounts of money. Some corporate actors kicked in certain amounts of money. I don't think it was at all an unreasonable use of resources. That would be the first thing to say. I think that the big lesson from the World Commission on Dams is that there's a difference, and there's actually a very good report that the World Resources Institute did about this that came out a couple of years ago. I think probably the single biggest lesson is there's a difference between building a robust insider stakeholder consensus and a somewhat less robust consensus that has somewhat broader buy-in, and that there are some real trade-offs there. Compared to some of the other sorts of stakeholder exercises that we're seeing going on, the World Commission on Dams tried to put on the Commission a wide range of views and then forge a strong intra-Commission consensus. One of the things that they had to do in order to do that was circle the wagons a little bit, and so there were some grievances from the sort of larger set of 50 or so semi-stakeholders who were sort of the advisory panel body for the Commission. And then, of course, governments that ultimately, at the end of the day, were supposed to take this and do something with it if they found it useful. That aspect of forging the strong consensus inside the Commission required them to not be, sort of drawn and quartered in the early stages in particular by all of the sort of noises that were coming out of civil society. I don't think we have very good design principles, if you will, for stakeholder dialogues yet to really deal with that. But it seems to me that how large is that initial sphere of consensus? And there's a difference between a sort of a representational notion of stakeholder dialogue and a more open and democratic one. I think the Commission leaned in one direction, and that had some benefits, that they got a more robust consensus within themselves than they otherwise would have. And so if you think the main value of it is the symbolic articulation of that consensus, which I think is valuable, then that was the right design choice. On the other hand, if you think it would be the broader aspects of buy-in, then perhaps it wasn't the right design choice. So that would be what I would pay particular attention to. On the point about water quantity and water quality, there's no question, there's 1 billion people, 1.4. I mean, the numbers at some point are so uncertain, but the current authoritative figure is 1.4 billion people who don't have reliable access to safe drinking water, either because they don't have the income, or because because the water's not there, or because they have to haul the water too far for that to be considered reliable access. So for varying reasons, people don't have it. Water is central, both in terms of sanitation, which is very closely tied to your water quality concerns, and drinking water, central to the Millennium Development Goals. The first interim report on the Millennium Development Goals shows that progress has been pretty uneven regionally, and that there are several world regions that are not going to make it by 2015 unless we take urgent and dramatic action right now. So it's an exceedingly pressing issue. And the Millennium Development Goals themselves, usually the UN declares that a problem will be vanquished in the coming decade, the water decade or whatever decade they're going to declare. The Millennium Development Goals were simply to cut by 50% the degree of global water insecurity. So it was not as ambitious a goal as might have been articulated to begin with, and it's not being attained. So there's an urgent message there, and I thank you for the question because it gives me a chance to say it. That being said, I wouldn't be so quick to completely parse water quality and water quantity. I'm not suggesting you were doing this, but I would be cautious to anyone who does just separate those issues. When I look at the health of the world's freshwater ecosystems and their ability to provide goods and services to people, my sense, there's really no yardstick for this, but my sense is it's clearly physical mucking around with the systems to provide bulk water supplies that is taking a greater toll than pollution. Not that pollution is not taking an enormous toll, but it's the fragmentation of rivers, the draining of wetlands, the filling in. It's those physical alterations that are probably the single bigger thing. That's why I've particularly emphasized those in this arena, because I see those as generating higher levels of contention in more places. But those can be, if not handled properly, handled properly, those can be a way to get drinking water to people. Handled poorly, they can greatly, greatly compound the access of poor people, local communities, traditional peoples, ethnic minorities, to have access to quality water. So the quantity-quality question at that local scale level is really in some ways the same question. The problem might be infrastructure that's poorly conceived, it might be the destruction of wetlands, or it might be the toxification of an aquifer, but at the end of the day, it's a tightly coupled problem of quantity and quality. The question about contentious politics, you made several great points, and I'll leave them to stand as they were. I would say that when I use the phrase contentious politics, I mean a form of politics where actors reserve the right to use extra institutional means. It does not mean that they always do so. Classic definition of a social movement is a large and mobilized, a mass mobilized group of people that are, pressing against traditional forms of authority. They want non-incremental change in the system, and while they don't always use extra institutional means, violence, direct action, various kinds of protest, monkey wrenching, etc. They are positioned such that that is an option that is always on the table. And that form of politics is fundamentally different than bargaining inside of legitimate institutions, be it using court systems or using other forms of political bargaining. So that's what I mean by contentious politics. It may not be violent, but it may. Your points about the grassroots is quite well taken, and I think the last thing that we need is another person who lives in the Washington suburbs talking about global governance and what the right principles are for global governance. That hasn't worked really well. I'm of several minds about that because I just won't go there. But what I'm trying to do is simply document the fact that because of the failing of the traditional mechanisms, which I would say, in a nutshell, the three musketeers are sort of, diplomacy, science, and foreign aid, if you will. Because of the failing of those traditional mechanisms, we are seeing the emergence of a new form of politics. Personally, I think that's a very healthy thing. I think change comes from struggle, and I see people organizing to defend their rights. And the idea of a human right to water has been an incredibly important symbol that brings together a lot of different actors in those struggles. Human rights advocates and environmental activists have a lot of common cause in this arena. They were relatively slow to realize that. And clearly today many groups have realized that, and I think they're doing a lot of good work around that. So I agree with much of what you said. When I say global, I mean global in the sense of widely present. I don't necessarily mean global in the sense of a sort of a top-down hierarchy. And I think in a sense that's probably the answer to your question as well. The vision in The Hague and the numbers that came out of The Hague were a supply-side solution coming out of global institutions. I have some serious differences of opinion about that, and I see a much more decentralized demand-side and bottom-up sort of solution. And so I don't see the problem as there not being adequate supplies of water such that we're 20 or 30 years away from a crisis. We're already in crisis for many people because of our institutional arrangements, not simply because of water and some iron laws of nature. It's way too quick, but that'd be a quick answer.
The gentleman in the back, we had a lady over here. Yep.
Lawrence Freeman from ER Magazine. I mean, it seems to me that, as was touched upon earlier by one of the participants, that water is a universal right, and that if you control water, you can actually control human life. So unless you're talking about population reduction for future generations, you have to have increasing supplies of fresh water. And traditionally, the state, carrying out the principle of the general welfare, has provided water for its citizens in terms of infrastructure projects and expanding water management and new technologies and science. And I don't know how you address this in your book, but it seems to me any attempt for privatization of water would actually be a means of attacking future growth of population and would have to be opposed, because it's the state, sovereign nation state, that has the responsibility and obligation for that. You can't put that in the hands of a private company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, the numbers on water are very funny. I'll just do this quickly.
Yep, sure.
Okay,
sure, no, go ahead.
Okay,
You're
great.
into it.
You know, it's hard to put precision on it, but the best guess is we use about 17% of the global runoff, you know, the portion between the rain and the sea. But if you subtract from that the water that is in very remote regions, you know, the interior of the Amazon or Siberia or what have you, and if you also subtract from that cascading floodwaters that we really don't have the capacity to trap, fortunately, because that water's needed where it goes, but we use about 40% of the available runoff. And many people look at that and they say, well, you know, it really is one of these instances where it's a fixed supply of a resource that is renewable in some sense of cycling, but is ultimately fixed. I just don't agree with that. And the reason I don't agree with that is because of the extraordinary inefficiency with which water is being used, particularly in agriculture, but also in many municipal and industrial and urban forms of application. There's no question at some point that ultimate limits may be reached. I don't know what the ultimate population of the Earth is going to be, and I don't know how efficiently we can squeeze human welfare out of a few drops of water. I very much agree with your comments about water as a universal right. And as the state, as I said earlier about states stepping away, as states step away from their historical responsibilities to provide that classic public goods, you know, other actors are trying to rush in and solve that problem. But I think that a vision that starts with the notion that we have to work on the supply side and accept both the way that we use water and the institutional arrangements we have to provide it as fixed is simply a non-starter. We're already at the point with the amount of water that we're tapping that even though we're not meeting this vast sea of unmet needs, we're already at the point where critical freshwater ecosystems are the most besieged kinds of ecosystems around the planet. And as we saw with Hurricane Katrina, we ignore that at our peril. The building of a very poorly conceived water infrastructure project and the decades-long process of destroying the wetlands in the larger region made the effects of Katrina far worse than they otherwise would have been, however bad they would have been. And so it isn't, you know, basic needs of people, particularly vulnerable people, on the one hand, and environment on the other. We have to find ways to do both together in an integrated fashion. And so for me, the critical institutional innovations are going to be the recognition of that human right, the giving of voice to a wider array of interested parties, particularly the ones that lack voice, and finding ways to deal more effectively with water on the demand side.
Okay. Ma'am, you got a question? Okay, Gary, yeah, go ahead, please.
Sylvia.
Sylvia Tognetti, I'm a consultant to IIED. You mentioned that a lot of these innovations had happened in windows of opportunity, you know, being in your two case studies, the fall of apartheid and the fall of the dictatorship in Brazil. But I could name several other instances of where things have happened like that in windows of opportunity, and I'm starting to wonder if anything happens when there isn't a window of opportunity. But, so I'm wondering if you have any observations or further comments on whether there was anything, in place before the window arose that then,
Sure.
or
sure.
What pre-existing efforts there were before the window came about.
Sure.
Sylvia, if you could just pass it right there in front of you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Isha Pant. I'm from Osgood Center. I'm from India, and there are a lot of water issues over there. We have tensions with Pakistan and Bangladesh and Narmada, and also internal disputes. There are two states in South India which have conflict over a river, and actually this issue that I'm talking about has been continuing since ages, and nothing has been actually done about it. And the reason is that the politicians, they want to keep this issue burning, and they take it as an opportunity. After every 5 years, they take it as an opportunity for re-election. The fact is that if the issue remains burning, it's in the best interest of the politicians and to maintain their vote bank. So I was just wondering how to deal with these kind of issues when the leaders are not interested. It's in their interest to keep the issue alive. How to deal with these kind of issues?
Great. I think, Ken, why don't we give you
Okay. Okay, first I'll take them in the order they came. First on the windows of opportunity. I certainly don't want to leave the impression that either in South Africa or Brazil, water problems have been solved and they've hit on the sort of the magic. Not that you implied that, but I just want to be clear on that. And I think, I thank you for the earlier question that points out that there's still a daily struggle for an awful lot of people in South Africa, and the same is true in Brazil. One of the things that I found most striking about the pattern of change in both of those countries, both the good and the bad changes from my own point of view, was that, yes, absolutely, there were the only reason that things changed. The window was a necessary but nowhere near sufficient condition. There's a mechanism in the South African water law called the reserve, which is basically, they prioritize human use, and they prioritize in-stream or blue water or environmental uses, and they basically suggest that all other uses are subordinate to that. Now, when you talk to water managers in South Africa about how they're actually going to make that real, you get this sort of deer in the headlights response. I mean, I don't say that in a disrespectful sort of way because it's extraordinary. I mean, many South African rivers are intermittent and so on, and there's just not a lot of water. In some cases, you could make the case that all the water has to go to the ecological reserve and there's no water left for anything else. So how that's actually going to translate is entirely unclear. But it's an important provision to push in that direction. And the reason that it exists is because there were people in South Africa who were looking at that question 25 years ago. So that's not a notion that came riding in on the white horse of integrated water resources management, and someone in South Africa happened to get religion. I mean, people in South Africa have been thinking about that question longer than most other places in the world that I can see. So it's really more that kind of a mechanism that was at work in these cases. That being said, it's easy to write a new national framework water law. Well, it's not easy, but it's being done all over the place. Sometimes because it's being pushed by the World Bank, or most of the collapse of law in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on. So there are many places where this is being done. The window of opportunity in Brazil and South Africa wasn't just to write the new law. It was actually that there were sort of actors in place to create the underpinnings of institutional reform, bureaucratic reorganization, et cetera, and I talk about some of that in the book. More so in Brazil, I would say, than in South Africa. There is somewhat of a difference in those two cases. So the window was necessary, but it was by no means sufficient, and it was, in some sense, people being organized. Windows come along, and if you're not ready when they come along, then the window alone is not going to get you very much. But I don't know. There's a metaphor there, a draft or something. The second question on, I don't have a good answer. I'm really glad you asked it, and I'll frankly acknowledge I don't have a good answer. There is no question that actors benefit from conflict. Some actors have a really strong interest in fomenting conflict, in keeping conflict alive, in keeping controversy alive, and you see them on all sides of these issues, and non-governmental as well as governmental, whether there's a business profit to be made or NGO donations to be gotten or whatever it is. You know, there's a lot of great people working in the water arena that I've encountered, but there's also no question that there are people who thrive on, you know, fomenting these kinds of controversies in governments and non-governmental alike. I think one of the things that's happened is that in the short term, as a broader cast of characters has started to get involved necessarily, that's clearly my view, in these dialogues, you know, there are some charlatans and there are some, you know, people who are pursuing other agendas and so on. And it's a sort of a bumpy road. And we've done enough of this now where there's this sort of first wave of kind of, you know, disgust at what the sausage-making aspects of this might really look at like when you get up close, and who speaks for whom, and who appointed you, and just because you happen to have a fax machine and are well organized doesn't mean you speak for everyone in the valley, and so on. And yet you know, international institutions might have a real interest in having you speak for everyone in the valley, and so on. And that's another aspect of the same thing. I do think, however, that there's a certain sort of settling out period of that, and that I get, maybe it's naive, but I hope that as we continue with this sort of, you know, broader cast of characters, our ability to recognize that for what it is, whether it's keeping conflict alive for the worst of reasons or purporting to speak for people, and there's really no one in line behind you, does become easier to see. But it's the Achilles heel of this form of politics, and so it is critically important that we keep an eye on it, and that's why it's a great question.
Well, I want to thank both Ken and Ashok for this stimulating conversation. Also, some exceptionally good questions. We don't always get such good questions, so appreciate the participation of the audience. Urge you to pick up a copy of the book outside if you haven't already, and definitely if you are interested in directing friends and colleagues to this discussion, we suggest that you direct them to the Wilson Center website, where in short order we'll have a meeting summary, a copy of Ken's slides, and the video that they can watch and listen to. So join me in thanking our panelists for the discussion. I sent a little note just saying, last night, sorry for being so quiet.
And then let's also, by next week, let's just settle on these dates. Beyond what their scope of work. I'll make that clear. Thank you. Yes.
Bem? Não, eu queria deixar o meu cartão. A gente está aqui. A WWF agora está.
Eu queria esse programa. Está fazendo o quê?
Então, o projeto que eu estou trabalhando é isso, é procurando desenvolver um regime global para recursos hídricos que ainda não existe. Então, vendo de que forma que a New York Convention, que papel que ela ainda poderia ter, apesar de não estar em vigor.
Olha, vamos fazer o seguinte.